I'd like to welcome everybody to our final CERC seminar of the semester. And before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to mention that we do have one more event tomorrow, and that is a workshop entitled "The Singapore Model and Its Influence on China." It'll be an all-day event. I realize that people don't have anything better to do on a Saturday, but in case we can persuade you otherwise, the event starts at 9:30. P4 704, Purple Zone, 4th floor, P704. But please, if you're interested, talk to Irene, who's here today, and mention that you're interested in coming. It goes through the afternoon. We have a number of distinguished speakers from the mainland, from Singapore and elsewhere, talking about how Singapore influences China or doesn't. But I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker today, who is a friend of several of us here and a very distinguished academic who's also been a practitioner. Donald Loh is Associate Dean at the Kuan School of Public Policy. Some of you will be familiar with that school, very influential in policy circles, both in Singapore and Southeast Asia and the world generally. He leads the school's executive education efforts, but also its case study unit. His research interests at the school include economics and public policy, inequality, social spending, behavioral economics, public finance, organizational change, and governance and politics in Singapore, which his talk will focus on today. He served in government, as I mentioned, 15 years, holding various senior positions in the Ministry of Finance and in other parts of government. He also established the Center for Public Economics at the Civil Service College of Singapore to advance economics literacy in the Singaporean government. He's the editor of Behavioral Economics and Policy Design, a pioneering book which details how the Singaporean government has applied ideas. His most recent book, which has been much discussed among academics interested in this topic, is Hard Choices: Challenging the Singapore Consensus, 2014, and I believe some of his comments today will pick up on that talk. Don, we're very pleased to have you as a visitor here. Also, thank you for attending the workshop tomorrow. Thanks again for coming.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Mark, for the very warm hospitality in organizing this session. I'm really looking forward to both this session and the conference tomorrow. So I've got Mark said I could speak for about 45 minutes. I don't think I have enough stuff in here to talk for 45 minutes, but I'll speak for maybe 20 minutes and we'll have plenty of time for questions. I'm going to talk about the extent to which I think, or rather the extent to which I do not think the Singapore model represents a model for any country. It's an extremely unique, sui generis experience, and I think among development policy circles, development policy makers, they're quite misguided in espousing the view that developing countries, even large ones like China and India, should try to copy or mimic the Singapore model. And in fact, we're doing a conference tomorrow on the Singapore model and its influence on China. I think that line of thinking that one can copy or mimic or replicate a unique experience such as Singapore's, I think it's actually quite misguided. And I'm going to argue that this afternoon. My skepticism about the possibility and desirability of copying or mimicking the Singapore model doesn't mean that we shouldn't learn about Singapore, shouldn't learn from the Singapore experience. I think it's quite useful to learn about and of the Singapore experience. In fact, that's one of the main reasons why many international students and public officials come to the Kuan School of Public Policy. But learning is not the same thing as copying or mimicking. And my central argument is this: I don't think the Singapore model can be copied, certainly not in its entirety. I don't even think that key aspects of the Singapore model can be copied or replicated to any meaningful extent. And if it turns out that some important aspect of the Singapore model can be copied, I'm not sure the outcome would necessarily be desirable for those countries that copied it. So in this talk, I would like to suggest three sets of reasons why I don't think the Singapore development experience is amenable to being copied by most countries or even all countries. The first reason is the fact that Singapore always has had quite unusual and indeed quite particularistic set of governing beliefs. At the heart of the Singapore model is a set of beliefs and worldviews that are quite unusual. And this makes the Singapore system of governance not particularly amenable to replication or mimicry. In my book, Hard Choices, I argued that governance in Singapore was premised on the idea of Singapore's inherent vulnerability. It's a national obsession. I mean, if there's a single word that defines governance in Singapore, it's this obsession with, this fetish with vulnerability. And this national obsession with vulnerability has legitimized quite a number of quite unusual policies and practices. So when people talk about, sometimes you hear people talking about the new political normal in Singapore, let's be clear that the contrast is not with the old normal, rather the contrast is with the old abnormal. And the abnormal practices born out of Singapore's inherent vulnerability paradigm include, amongst several things, first, an extreme form of elite governance to guard against populist, myopic, or demagogic politics. Second, a strict meritocracy for the purpose of identifying the best and brightest for the ruling elite. Third, a high degree of state paternalism. I think when Hong Kongers think about Singapore, the first thing to think about is that Singapore is a nanny state, a paternalistic state. So a high degree of state paternalism that at the same time insists on individual responsibility when it comes to things like state welfare. Fourth, an aversion to state welfare and a general indifference to issues of inequality. Fifth, a high level of skepticism about the appropriateness of ordinary democratic arrangements for the city-state, for Singapore. And sixth, a belief in the possibility and desirability of social engineering. Collectively, these beliefs form what I have termed the Singapore consensus. It is a consensus in that the majority of Singaporeans, by and large, have come to accept and expect each of these beliefs across various aspects of governance in Singapore. When Lee Kuan Yew passed away last year, there were a number of articles and op-eds that were written about his legacy, some negative, but mostly largely positive. And perhaps the most widely circulated was a piece on Huffington Post and the UK newspaper, The Independent, by a certain Kelvin Cheng. You wouldn't have heard of him. But in Singapore circles, he's a reasonably well-known apologist for the PAP government in Singapore. And in responding to the common criticism that Lee Kuan Yew built a safe, prosperous, but less than free or democratic society, Cheng argues in that op-ed, quotes, "Freedom is being able to walk on the streets unmolested in the wee hours in the morning, to be able to leave one's door open and not fear being burgled. Freedom is the woman who can ride buses and trains alone. Freedom is not having to avoid certain subway stations after night falls. Freedom is knowing our children can go to school without fear of drugs or being mowed down by some insane person with a gun. Freedom is knowing that we are not bound by our class, our race, our religion, and that we can excel as the individuals that we are, the freedom to accomplish. Freedom is living in one of the least corrupt societies in the world, knowing that our ability to get things done is not limited by our ability to pay someone. Freedom is fresh air and clean streets, because nothing is more inimical to our liberty of movement than being trapped at home because of the suffocating smog." It would be funny if not for the fact that this was widely shared. Singaporeans took great pride that somebody had the balls to say this to the Western media. So clearly, the Singapore establishment is not bothered by the fact that its model of governance does not fall neatly into a liberal democratic paradigm. I would also argue that each of the beliefs that constitute the Singapore consensus is not only unique to Singapore, but is implemented to an extent that is seldom seen elsewhere. Collectively, they create a very unusual ideological context against which any of Singapore's policies and governing practices must be understood. Trying to copy any of those policies without an understanding of this larger ideological context is to commit a basic fallacy in thinking that policies in one environment can be grafted onto a different operating environment and be expected to produce the same results. But you may argue that governments elsewhere should not copy the Singapore government's unusual beliefs to copy its mostly successful policies. You can say that developing countries should mimic Singapore's free trade policies, its model of export-led industrialization, its status as a financial hub, its long-term urban planning practices, its rule of law, its relative absence of corruption, its macroeconomic and financial stability, its public housing program, its health financing policies, or any of the policies that's in Singapore that are commonly lauded internationally. So the second reason why I think Singapore's model can't be really copied elsewhere is that the context and conditions that enabled many of these policies to be successful, in Singapore's case, are on hindsight extremely unusual. These conditions are now changing quite profoundly and are becoming less relevant for the future, both for Singapore itself and for the developing countries that are looking to Singapore as an example. Take our success with export-led industrialization as an example. While this strategy was highly successful for Japan and the East Asian tigers, it is a far less effective strategy in a world where every emerging economy now welcomes foreign investments. More importantly, in a world where developed countries are less able and willing to be the world's consumers of last resort, export-led growth has probably run its course as the surest way to prosperity. 7 years after the global financial crisis, demand in the developed world remains extremely weak. Larry Summers has suggested we are likely to see a prolonged period of secular stagnation. Emerging markets, which were resilient immediately after 2008, now face slow growth and debt problems of their own, and recent troubles and China's slowdown in recent months is an indication of that. Emerging markets are also probably far too reliant on fickle capital inflows and commodity booms. Conceivably, China and India may one day take the place of the developed world as the world's consumers, but in the medium term, this is extremely unlikely. Indeed, China's own success with export-led industrialization has made it more challenging for other developing countries to find a foothold in manufacturing. And as Danny Roderick of Harvard has argued, many industries that were previously the growth escalators for developing countries, such as garments, textiles, electronics, and steel, are likely to face shrinking global markets and overcapacity. In short, the effectiveness of relying on exports as a model to drive rapid economic growth was always highly context dependent. And the context today for developing countries that are just beginning to develop and to industrialize and are looking to exports to drive growth, that context is a far less benign and propitious one. What about the rule of law, zero tolerance of corruption, and the sanctity of contracts as things which developing countries should copy from Singapore? It is certainly true that these qualities are important for Singapore. They are essential if you want to be the trade and financial hub of your region. But for most emerging economies, being a trading and financial hub is neither a realistic nor appropriate economic ambition. By definition, there can only be a few hubs in a network. Existing hubs like Singapore, like Hong Kong, have enjoyed significant advantages of scale, of network externalities, and the cumulative advantages conferred by their own histories as hubs. And the best examples of these advantages in Asia, of course, Hong Kong, Shanghai, and Singapore, which all started life as port cities. Their current hub status, to a large extent, is a result of their history. For most emerging economies, the appropriate model they should look at isn't small port cities like Hong Kong and Singapore, but the successful industrialized Asian countries of Japan, Korea, and to some extent Taiwan. None of them succeeded because of rule of law or zero corruption. Or look at China in the last 30 years. You can get very far economically if you had even if you didn't have rule of law, clean government, or the sanctity of contracts. A third area where development policymakers commonly point to success in Singapore as a model for others is public housing. So what about public housing, which in my view is Singapore's greatest policy innovation? Does that offer a useful model for developing countries and cities? Now, the idea of the state providing subsidized housing is not unique to Singapore. Many cities in the developed world have this. Hong Kong has quite an extensive public housing program. But the difference is that in other countries they call it social housing, in Singapore we call it public housing. What is unique to Singapore is the extent of state involvement in the provision of housing, the proportion of Singaporean households who own and live in publicly developed flats and publicly subsidized flats, and perhaps most importantly, the fact that public housing in Singapore is the de facto welfare state. Instead of cash transfers, the state provides citizens quite a large asset transfer in the form of a highly subsidized public flat. Instead of providing public pensions, which do not exist in Singapore, the state tells you that your flat is your primary form of retirement security. So can this unique asset-based version of the welfare state be a model for other countries? I think it's certainly very innovative, the public housing program in Singapore, in the sense that no other government in the world uses public housing or social housing as the primary form of redistribution and as a substitute for pension and welfare provision. It's very innovative, but it's also quite useless as a piece of advice to developing countries grappling with housing shortages or welfare reform. Very few countries in the world have the legislative or institutional capacity to develop publicly financed housing on a large scale. Unlike Singapore, they won't have a Land Acquisition Act which gives the state compulsory land acquisition powers. Most countries do not have what we call the CPF system, what Hong Kongers would call the MPF system of forced savings that encourages, even induces, high rates of home ownership. And most countries will not have a professionally competent housing and development board as we do in Singapore. The ones that do have compulsory land acquisition powers, for instance, Chinese provincial and local governments, tend to use those powers to enrich themselves. So in many Chinese cities, local governments expropriate land from farmers, sell the land to real estate developers, who then develop housing and commercial facilities on a purely commercial basis. The increase in land values is pocketed by local governments rather than returned to people in the form of subsidized housing. But that doesn't mean that Singapore can't teach the world of a thing or two in housing. Although Singapore's public housing policies are highly context dependent and largely irrelevant to the rest of the world, the Singapore government's engineers, housing engineers and architects can be extremely useful to city governments that want to develop low-cost residential estates for their people. So I don't think Singapore can teach the world how to run an entire public housing system, but it may be able to teach the world how to build low-cost flats quickly. In short, the policymakers are quite useless, but the engineers, the architects, the planners may be of some use yet. Finally, you may argue that what other countries or cities ought to copy from Singapore isn't our beliefs or our specific policies such as export-led industrialization, housing, or rule of law, both of which are, both the beliefs and policies are quite unique to Singapore and are highly context dependent. Instead, what you might argue that what countries and cities should follow or copy from Singapore are the principles of pragmatism, flexibility, and constant adaptation that are worthy of emulation and mimicry. I would agree that these are extremely valuable attributes for governments to acquire. Indeed, I would say they're probably the most important attributes a government can have. But I'll also be inclined to say that the Singapore government today no longer represents a role model for these qualities. They might have in the past, but certainly not today. I said earlier that Singapore's success derives a great deal from its status as a trade, financial, and logistics hub. And I also said this was largely a function of our history. We began life as a British port city. We were an entrepot, an intermediary, a trading hub, and more lately, a financial center. Even though we were quite successful in industrialization, this was driven largely by multinational corporations, and to some extent by the large government-linked companies that Singapore had inherited from the British. I'll leave you to reflect on the consequences of our high reliance on foreign investments and also foreign labor, which has now become a very contentious political issue in Singapore. But it's very telling that the architect of our industrialization strategy, industrialized through multinational corporation strategy, our first Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister, Goh Keng Swee, always thought that this strategy was a self-limiting one. For him, MNCs were a shortcut to industrialization, not the long-term economic development strategy. And this is what Goh Keng Swee had to say about Singapore's growth model back in 1972. This was him talking about the growth model, the growth strategy that he himself had crafted, that he himself had been the primary architect of. So I'm quoting from Goh Keng Swee now. There have been no studies, to my knowledge, of the relative dependence of these countries on foreign investments as an instrument of economic growth. My own subjective impression is that this dependence on foreign investment, on foreign capital, is strongest in Singapore, and that the participation of national entrepreneurs in promoting industrial and economic development is smaller in Singapore than in other countries. So what other countries is he referring to? Not only is Singapore more dependent on foreign entrepreneurs than are Hong Kong, Taiwan, and South Korea, but Singapore's position is probably unique in that she is now dependent on a continuing supply of foreign workers to sustain growth. This then is the setting against which we have to consider our long-term problem of income distribution. The question we must answer sooner or later is this: when do we stop growing? Or to be more precise, at what point do we stop importing foreign workers and cease to encourage foreign entrepreneurs and capital in Singapore? Because of our meaning Singapore, our limited land area, industrial expansion, together with the concomitant population expansion, will produce overcrowding to increasingly uncomfortable limits. This was said in 1972. It could have been said last week and it would still be just as relevant. 1972 was also the year when S. Rajaratnam, another of Singapore's founding generation of ministers, delivered his famous Global City speech. And I quote from that speech: "But times are changing and there will be less and less demand for the traditional type of entrepot services that Singapore has rendered for well over a century. Its role as the entrepot city of Southeast Asia, the marketplace of the region, will decrease in importance. This is because Singapore is transforming itself into a new kind of city, a global city. By linking up with international and multinational corporations, Singapore not only becomes a component of the world economy, but is offered a shortcut to catch up or at least keep pace with the most advanced industrial and technological societies. By plugging in this way, we can achieve in 20 to 30 years what otherwise would have taken a century or more to achieve." So Rajaratnam too believed that our MNC strategy was a shortcut, and like Goh, he recognized the limits of the Singapore's of the global city vision that he articulated. So at the end of that very speech that I just quoted from, the global city speech, he said, quotes, "I've dealt largely with the economic aspects of Singapore as a global city, but the political, social, and cultural implications of a global city are no less important. The political, social, and cultural problems, I believe, will be far more difficult to tackle. They may be the Achilles heel of emerging global cities." So Singapore's foreign capital-led growth model and S. Rajaratnam's vision of Singapore as a global city worked well, I think, for Singapore for the first 3 or 4 decades as an independent country. But it is hardly a model for Singapore today, and certainly not a model for other countries. And for Singapore, as she enters her second half century as an independent city-state, the development model of the first few decades should really be seen as what they are, a shortcut that was probably not viable in the long haul. So in terms of both space and time, the ideas that made Singapore a success story in the first 50 years, what I've called the Singapore consensus, would eventually, in my opinion, run into seriously diminishing, if not outright negative returns. Thank you.